Welcome to TechnoViews, a new podcast featuring major figures in the humanities and social science on topics in the intersections of techno-science, culture, and society in Asia and beyond. I'm Loretta, Assistant Professor in Anthropology at Durham University in the UK. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Stevan Harrell, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington, where he taught from 1974 to 2017. Professor Harrell has conducted ethnographic and interdisciplinary fieldwork in Taiwan and China. And in this interview podcast, we're going to dive deep into his latest book, An Ecological History of Modern China, published by the University of Washington Press. Steve, welcome to TechnoViews.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, it's a very large book, but I enjoy reading it so much. I guess my first question is something that you've mentioned early in the book, which is about environmental history and ecological history. So, environmental history of China is a rapidly growing field. And in the book, you said ecological history is more than another name for environmental history. Can you tell us more what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think the subject matter of environmental history and ecological history tend to be the same. The difference lies in the approach. Ecological history takes a systems approach that is derived from systems ecology or resilience ecology, and sees all the variables that I name in the book, trees, water, air, pollution, movies, art, politics, culture, and sees them interacting with one another just like the different actors in an ecosystem act with one another. So it is environmental history, but it's environmental history in a particular kind of conceptual framework.
So apart from what you've just talked about from a different analytical framework, if you like, and also the difference in chronological scope, how does your ecologically informed approach differ from, say, Mark Alvin's The Retreat of the Elephants or Judith Shapiro's Mao's War Against Nature?
Well, with regard to Mark Alvin, he's been a very conventional, very learned historian of China for a long time, but he takes a really linear view of the history. In other words, he sees the last 3,000 years of Chinese history as a single progression toward impending disaster. He had an interesting early article before he wrote the book called 3,000 Years of Unsustainable Growth. Well, my first reaction is 3,000 years, that sounds, that's a pretty good record. Most things don't get sustained that long. But he sees this as a linear progression, and he really is not concerned with the kind of feedback loops, particularly negative feedback loops, self-correcting feedback that the ecological history approach would take. Now, the ecological history approach, of course, things can go into positive feedback chains of self-reinforcing, but Elvin seems to take that as a kind of a linear progression that happens for granted. And mine is more things interacting with one another in loops and chains. As far as Judith Shapiro's Mao's War Against Nature, she really begins with the political economy and takes that, particularly policy, as the prime mover, and the ecosystem or nature as the thing that it affects. And so we see policies affecting nature rather than feedback between nature, or the natural world, the biological world, and the politics. And again, it's also a kind of a single linear progression in which the politics ruins the ecosystem. And once again, I'm more agnostic about that. Things can feed back, they can get better, they can get worse, they certainly change. But I think the big difference with both books is that my approach is systemic, deriving from systems theory, and theirs is linear, deriving from conventional history.
Yeah, definitely. I can't really think of another book that takes such systemic approach and looking at not only the impact but also the feedback loop, and also you mentioned about the cultural and institutional buffers. So let's dive into the book. So what I find really interesting, especially in the second part of your book, is you talk about the ecological disruptions that development has brought to the land, water, and food of China. And I was particularly struck by the chapters about food, in which you mentioned that although China remains largely self-sufficient in terms of food, it imports a large amount of soybeans, primarily for use as livestock feed. And this revelation was quite shocking to me because I had never thought that the soybeans that I love and I really enjoy so much, I used to feed pigs and animals. So it sounds incredibly wasteful to me. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the first thing is it's new. People used to feed pigs table scraps, garbage, things that they'd harvested in the field that they couldn't eat. Sometimes they would actually grow some kind of crop partially for pig feed. But the pigs were part of a local system, again, that included these feedback loops. You grow food, you eat part of it, you deposit manure, the pigs deposit manure, the human manure and the pig manure come together into a pool, combine that with straw, you put it on the field, that provides nitrogen for the crops, and there's a circular closed loop kind of economy. But you can't do that and have a lot of meat to eat. You can have a little, but people now want a lot. Chinese people now consume about half the animal protein that Americans do, and Americans consume way too much. And it's about 5 times as much animal protein per capita as they consumed in 1980. Well, there's no closed feedback loop that can accommodate that much pork. So you have to feed the pork something besides the garbage table scraps, and you probably need some kind of fertilizer other than just the pig manure in order to fertilize the fields. But even then you can't produce enough feed. So you have to import the pig feed. And what the great majority of the pig feed that's imported is soybeans, which provide the protein part of the pig feed. And most of those are grown in Brazil, number 1, United States, number 2, Argentina, number 3, a little bit in Canada, a little bit in Russia, a little bit in Bolivia. But what it means is that in many ways, China is exporting the environmental changes that happen when you convert a forest or a savanna to a bean field. And China imports about 80% of its soybeans, and almost all of those go into pig feed. A few of them go into those delicious snacks, but that's probably like 1 or 2%. The other thing that China imports for pig feed increasingly is corn, although it's growing a lot more corn than it used to, and people consume almost none. And almost all that goes into pig feed. But unlike soybeans, only about 10 to 20% of the corn actually is imported. The rest is grown domestically.
Mm-hmm. And in that chapter, when you talk about soybean, and you also mentioned something about milk. So I think the Chinese people's new appetite for milk is also extremely interesting, and actually many scholars have written about it. And meanwhile, I think both in the UK and in the United States, people are turning to plant-based milk. And neither seems to be a sustainable solution to me. What do you think?
Well, on the one hand, dairy products, that is, say, cow's milk, to a lesser extent, goat or sheep milk, is the most efficient way to convert raw calories that happen in plant crops to animal protein for human consumption. It's way more efficient in this conversion than any other, any kind of meat or fish. So dairy is the best thing from that standpoint. But at the same time, as we all know, cows take a lot of land for pasture. And if people are drinking milk, then there have to be more cows, and that means more land put into pasture. In fact, it gets to the point, and it has done that now in the United States and much of Europe, where cows don't go on pasture at all. They're fed crops that are grown, corn, sometimes even soybeans, and then they're kept in the barn. And large dairies, the cows go back and forth from the milking parlor to the barn, the milking parlor to the barn, and they never see grass. But I think, it's the same kind of thing as pork. It's a matter of quantity. A little bit of dairy products, a little bit of meat, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is it gets to be too much. And so this is something that China hasn't gotten to yet, because they still consume way, way less dairy products per person than, for example, English or Germans or Dutch. But it could reach that. And the other side of it, of course, that people are all worried about is the so-called question of lactose intolerance, where many people genetically in parts of Asia don't have the gene that produces lactase, which you could break down lactose. And supposedly that means you have all sorts of digestive problems when you consume dairy products. But in fact, some people do and some people don't, and there are people who don't have the gene who seem to be able to drink milk, just fine. As far as plant milk, well, why bother? If you want, if you want oats, eat oatmeal. If you want almonds, eat almonds. If you want rice, eat rice. Why convert it into something like milk? It seems to me is a kind of a waste of time and energy.
I think the reason people do it is they either can't tolerate the cow milk, or they are vegetarian or vegans. And I think that leads me to ask the next question, which is about veganism. Do you think veganism is the way to go for in terms of sustainability?
It's virtuous for individual persons to be vegans. There are some things you have to watch your diet much more closely in order to get all the nutrients, but you can do it. The Aztecs did it with corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. So it's very possible to do. The problem is people aren't going to do it. How are you possibly going to convince 1.4 billion people who see themselves as with all the problems of today's society, today's culture, today's pollution, at least they can eat meat whenever they want to, unlike their great-grandparents who could get it at New Year's if they were, not too poor. And you're going to convince them, oh, no, you shouldn't do that. You should go back to eating even less meat than your great-grandparents did, for the sake of the planet. That's not going to happen. So if individuals want to be vegans, that's great. But I don't think you could ever convince a population not to eat at least dairy products. Of course, there are lots of vegetarians, specifically upper caste people in India who are vegetarians, but they consume a lot of milk products. If you take the milk products out and so forth, I don't think you could ever transform a culture to the point where people would do that. So it's not a quantitatively serious solution to these large-scale problems of food and nutrition.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what you call the CCCM agriculture, which is consolidate, chemicalized, and commercialized, and mechanicalized. Am I right?
Right.
Agriculture and the alternative food networks. So as you may know, an increasing number of people have grown tired of what they call the urban rat race. I have actually a few students writing dissertations about that. And some choose to return to the countryside in pursuit of a more balanced lifestyle, and it is estimated that more than 11 million people in China had returned to rural areas from cities, with a significant portion being probably unemployed young individuals. Now, regardless of their motivation, it seems that these urban residents have become the backbone, from what I've heard, of China's Community Support Agriculture (CSA) movement, which you've also written about in the book. So, I guess to some extent, they respond to Xi Jinping's call for revitalizing China's rural economy. And so there are a lot of things here, and I just wonder what are your thoughts on this trend?
Well, it's one of several similar trends, many of which are actually prompted, I think, by fears about food safety, which are huge in China. There are a lot of legitimate food scandals. There was the famous Digoyo, returning the gutter oil to the dining table, Digoyo Huan Fan Zhuo. And that was a real thing. It wasn't really gutters. It didn't really come out of the gutters, but it was reused oil. It was dirty oil. It was cooking oil scraped off of the fume hoods, and, all sorts of gross stuff like that. And there have been others. There was the famous melamine scandal. But in general, urban people are suspicious of the food they buy, all of the food they buy. So you start getting a craze for organic food. And the problem with organic food is you can go on Taobao and buy these little stickers that says, 有机食品, organic food product. You can buy those for, 5,000 for 100 kuai, something like that. So people, they see organic and they don't trust it as being organic. They only trust it as being organic if they see it's got holes in it or it's imperfect or something like that. So then you get farmers like drilling holes in their green peppers and putting worms on the food to make it look organic. And then you get this cycle, back and forth. The point is people don't trust the food system. And they have good reasons for not trusting the food system. So there are all these alternative things. And one of them is the community-supported agriculture. Another one is farmers markets. And another one is the so-called 城市农民, the urban people. So farmers that are fairly close to a city, you can pay something at the beginning of the season and you can rent yourself a little plot and you can grow your own vegetables. And the farmers will show you how to do it because you're probably really klutzy and you won't be able to do it unless the farmers help. So it's the CSA is one corner or one variety of this trend toward taking care of the fears or confronting the fears about food safety. But also, of course, I think as it is in many countries, there are people who return to the land for kind of romantic reasons. I think that, we should be doing like our ancestors do. We should know where our food comes from. And one of the ways that you can do that is you contract with a farmer who grow food for you. The one that I know best is outside Chengdu. You can't just contract with him. You have to come out and work for a day and get to know the farmers, because people think it's more important to buy from someone you trust than it is to have some sticker that says organic that they might have bought on Taobao, or they might have, bribed the local official to give them an organic certification. And anyway, organic certification is expensive, and very small farmers can't do it. So I see this, as something that's happening in China that's very much like what's happening in other parts of the world. People want to get more connected to the food they eat, to the land that they live on, to the place that their food comes from. And this is a healthy thing. But again, like veganism, it's probably always going to be a minority thing. And it's probably always going to be associated with people who are affluent enough and educated enough to care about these things, because they don't really they're not really in any danger of not being able to get their next meal. So they're really looking for their next meal to be healthy, both in a personal sense and in a kind of ecological sense.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thanks for indulging me in a very interesting discussion about China's food future. It's something that, as you know, I'm working on, and I also have colleagues who are working on CSA, alternative food networks. So those people should definitely pick up the book and read those chapters. So now, should we turn to one of your favorite topics, as your former students? I know it is demographics. So why don't you tell me some of your arguments about population growth in the book?
Well, it's been a trigger, or it's been a motivating factor for the transformations that have happened in the food system and in the land in general in China in the last 75 years. Of course, the first thing was that the reason China's population grew moderately, say from the time of the Taiping uprising in the 1850s until 1950, was that mortality was so high. And so people had lots of babies, but many of them, probably 3 out of 10, didn't survive their first year. And one of the first things that the communists did was to institute effective public health programs, including vaccination, including elimination of certain diseases, parasitic diseases. And so the population grew even faster. And of course, they were happy to have this because they felt like, we need more people, Judy Shapiro in her book talks about this slogan, 人多力量大, right? If people are plentiful, then our strength is great. And so population really exploded between 1950 and 1957. Then, of course, came the Great Leap Forward, and there was a huge famine, and probably 30 million excess deaths. Some people say 40, some people say 20. It's kind of a grotesque counting game like we play with Holocaust and other huge tragedies in world history. But it picked up, and the population grew even more after the Great Leap Forward was over, until in the middle 1960s, leadership finally began to think, maybe we have too many people, or the population is growing too fast. But then this was overtaken by the Cultural Revolution, where people weren't worried about much except the Cultural Revolution. And then in the 70s, you get the late sparse and few Wan Xi Shao program, and then the famous Jihua Sengyu, or so-called one-child policy, and so on. But this growth of the population, and after all, we have 600 million people at the beginning, we have 1 billion people by 1990. This is almost a doubling, and we have a 2.5 times from the beginning of the People's Republic to now. This is one of the things that keeps pushing all of these changes in food production and the production of other commodities, because you got to keep up with the population growth. And they really only just barely kept up, if you look at it on a sort of averaging out basis, between 1950 and the early 1980s. It wasn't until after 1980 that food production lurched ahead of population growth, and then you start getting these changes in the diet. So it's all related to one another.
I can really tell it's your favorite topic. For listeners who are not seeing who are not seeing the screen right now, is but nowadays China have a different problem. People don't want to have babies. They are unwilling to have babies, and the CCP see it as a demographic crisis. And what do you think? Do you want to say more about this?
Yeah, I think it's a great thing for the Earth. Mm-hmm. We have 4 times as many humans on the Earth as we did when I entered in 1947, and consumption standards are growing, and we can't have as many people. I mean, there are all sorts of other problems that are linked to it. Consumption standards are too high in Euro-American countries, or global north, if you want to call it that, and they're still too low in many parts of the world. Need to come up, but eventually, of course, they will. And in every country, fertility ends up coming down when people reach a certain level of affluence. Now, it's happening so rapidly in China. You see these pendulum swings. It's another kind of systems theory thing. Something goes too far and there's a negative feedback that sort of brings it back to a norm. But in this case, it's going to the other extreme. And fertility in China is now well under one child born per woman. And everybody's panicking. They say, oh my God, we're not going to have enough working people to feed the elderly. We're going to have a whole whole nation full of old folks tottering around and needing care. We're not going to have as much innovation in the tech industry because we're not going to have as many young people. And yeah, this is true, but at the same time, at some point, fertility's got to come down. We simply can't accommodate 20 or 30 billion people on this earth. And so it's necessary for the earth to remain habitable, that population decrease, and it's also inevitable as long as living standards keep increasing and educational standards, especially for women, are increasing in most of the world. So the problem is the soft landing. The problem is if fertility goes down too fast, well, then maybe these problems of elder care and medical care and not enough employment and innovation, these might be bigger problems. But on the whole, it seems to me that if Chinese people don't want to have babies, for the earth in the long term, it's a good thing.
Now, so I think people who have read the book, many readers and commenters, they would agree that this is not only a book about the ecological history of modern China, but it's really a momentous documentation of the PRC's remarkable social changes and transformations. So do you see this as a culmination of your long career in Chinese studies?
Yeah, it's the last big book I'll ever write. I started it out as I've said, actually I said the preface to the book. It started out as a conference paper for a conference on new approaches to Chinese history, and ended up getting expanded and expanded and expanded. But yeah, I'll write a thing or two here or there. We've just written a book review on eco-literature and that kind of thing. But I'm pretty much done with Chinese studies as far as any big projects go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess then the next question has to be about the next project. So years ago, when I was, I think it was my first year in Oxford, and I was in a dining hall, and I sat next to a retired professor, who turned out to be Mark Alvin, which I didn't know at that time. So that was one of the most embarrassing things that has happened. But anyway, we had a conversation, and he told me that he's retired, but he said he 退而不休. So I guess that's true for you too. Can you tell us what you're working on? What's your next project?
Well, I've written a memoir which it's not right yet. I'm going to have to rewrite it, but it is China related. It's a memoir about the school that we helped start and fund in Liangshan, Yizhou, in southwestern Sichuan, which ran from 2000 to 2016. And, it addresses the question of philanthropy, and is philanthropy really doing any good? But also I hope it provides some sort of local color for people to see what happens in, a part of China that is not very much in the news. On the one hand, it's not Beijing, Shanghai. On the other hand, it's not Xinjiang, where people are being thrown in jail for no reason at all, including distinguished professors, like our good friend Rahile. So it's a part that kind of gets neglected, but at the same time, I think it's a bit of a critique of the, guilt-motivated critique of the so-called white savior complex. When it comes down to it, I think we did do something good by starting and maintaining the school. And it would have happened anyway, but it would have happened later. So there's that. But mainly I'm moving into local environmental history or ecological history, and I'm compiling material for history of agriculture here in the extreme northwest corner of the continental United States, in Whatcom County, Washington, and showing how this same movement towards CCM agriculture since the 1950s and 1960s, happened a little earlier here than in China, how that has promoted and distorted commercial agriculture in this part of the world, and also how there has been a kind of similar alternative food movement. Small farmers growing, good vegetables. There's even a farmer that grows loofahs out here and sells them. And people, starting young organic pig farms and sheep farms, people transitioning from these big dairies that have 2,000 cows that never see grass, and selling off many of their cows and grazing them and then selling a specialized milk product. And, it has the advantage of being able to do it at home as one gets older, and one doesn't necessarily want to be spending all that time with jet lag, as one does when one is working overseas. So that's the next thing.
Right, sounds super productive for me, and you're definitely 退而不休. So, thank you so much for being with us today, Steve. I look forward to your next book.
Well, I hope it'll happen, and thanks once again for having me. As usual, this has been fun.
Thank you. So, you've just listened to an interview with Professor Harrell about his latest book, An Ecological History of Modern China. Thank you for listening today, and hope to see you soon.